Welcome to Season 3 of the Student Christian Movement podcast. SCM is a community of students, past and present, and we hope to be a generous community expressing a lived faith in Jesus Christ where social action meets prayerful devotion. We seek to be both a radical voice for equality and justice, as well as a safe home for progressive Christian students. In Season 3 of the SCM podcast, we will be exploring Christian political action, including everything from voting and democracy to trade unions and political organising. With over 4 billion people expected to vote this year, it is a massive year for democracy and politics globally. We want to equip students with the tools that they need to be able to engage with politics on a local level, a national level, in their communities and their workplaces. We will explore these themes with a variety of guests from different political backgrounds, including activists, academics, and theologians. We pray that this podcast series will help you to discern what God requires of you, to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome back to the SCM podcast. Today I'm joined by Matt and Dean from the Magnificast. Matt, Dean, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks, William.
So for those who are unfamiliar with the Magnificast, although I'm sure a lot of SCM members and listeners to this podcast will be familiar with you already, do you want to give us a little bit of an intro to who you are and what you do? And we'll start with Dean, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. The Magnificast is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, as we say every week on the show. And it's kind of an excuse for Matt and I to hang out. That's really the reason that it exists. But more generally, we've spent a lot of time since it must have been 2016 or something like that, exploring all kinds of stuff. All the old Orbis books that are out of print about liberation theology, we're reading them. We're talking to journalists. We're talking to theologians. We're talking to each other about what's going on in the world. And it's really just a space to try to think through those intersections between Christianity and the left. Matt, what am I leaving out?
No, about it. I mean, the podcast is about Christianity and leftist politics. Sometimes does meander into whatever vibe we're feeling. But yeah, I think that we dig pretty deep in that vein of Christian activism, liberation theology, trying to be like really inclusive of the various traditions that exist of like Christianity and like political thought. So yeah, that's probably about it though.
Yeah, I think it really does fill a space for a lot of the podcasts that are out there, because you often find that really kind of good leftist podcasts will be of a secular vein, and then those that are Christian will be dealing primarily with those kind of theological questions of like what the Bible is and what church is and how we relate to all of that. So I think it's good being able to bring those two streams together, and think that you both do that really well. But obviously you mentioned that part of the podcast is keeping in touch with each other. But I mean, Matt, you moved to Scotland fairly recently. So what actually inspired you in the beginning to start the Magnificast? Like, how long has it been going for now?
Yeah, like Dean said, I think we started in 2016 or 2017. It's hard exactly to say. The story of how it started is always, it's just embarrassing to tell, I think. We started the podcast because Dean and I were friends, kind of carrying out of an internet forum where we're always talking about Christianity and Marxism and socialism, and sometimes arguing about it too. So yeah, out of that fertile ground of being internet weirdos, we decided to do this podcast together. And I think it started at a really important time because it was 2016 in the United States. So it was the rise of Trumpism and after the election and so on. So yeah, I mean, we were kind of able to speak into that moment and offer some kind of alternative vision of Christianity that might exist.
And outside of your personas as podcasters, what is it that you do with your time? So Dean, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Yeah, outside of my persona as a podcaster, it's hard to imagine speaking into this microphone what else I do. But yeah, I work for a Catholic Solidarity movement here in Canada that has partners in the Global South, and try to spend a lot of time kind of organizing with and thinking with Christians who are progressive here in Canada. I'm from the US originally, like Matt, but made the move here quite a while ago now. So including the SCM, it's been really lovely to meet SCM Canada and the folks in Cuba and the US, and it's such a powerful movement. So I spend a lot of time just thinking about those kinds of things. I used to have a journalism career, but I've kind of let it go dormant on purpose. Yeah. So I do that less now, but every once in a while, some writing. And people who listen to the Magnificast will also know that Matt and I have this mutual photography hobby that we've just started. So that's our new thing that we're bonding over outside of Christianity and politics, taking a bunch of photos.
Yeah, that's great. Before, Matt, you share with us what you do outside of your persona as a podcaster, why don't you tell us what type of camera you have, Dean?
Sure. Well, one great benefit of living in Canada is there are all kinds of extremely cheap and weird Soviet cameras just floating around from cool. I don't know, everyone's Ukrainian grandparents that are passing away, so they end up in a garage sale. So I've been using this Beloma Vilya camera. It's a mechanical camera. It is built like a tank, and it takes really funny pictures. I love it. That's I have some other cameras, but that's probably my favorite one right now. It's very simple and frustrating, and I like that about it.
That's great. Matt, what camera is it that you have just now?
Yeah, so the important question up front here. Yeah. I have a Nikon D6500 DSLR, and I like it a lot. I recently got a big, long telescoping lens for it, so I can take pictures of birds very close, which is my whole goal in life outside this podcast. Influenced like Dean, I did buy an old Soviet camera from a very old man in Glasgow, and I have a Zenit E with a really cool old Soviet lens on it called the Helios lens. It is a great camera, and it is extremely heavy. It takes very dreamy photos. They're all they come out not very sharp. I guess that's the nice way of saying it. They're not very sharp photos because of how old it is, and maybe some things are going on wrong on the inside of it, but it's a very cool camera. Apart from that, I work for a trade union in the trenches of the class war, trying to get nurses paid right. That's my whole job. And putting stuff on the internet about it is basically it. Yeah, so trade union, cameras, that's about it. That's all I have time for.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I recently switched from a Nikon DSLR to a mirrorless camera, and have to say that I'm thoroughly enjoying the change with that. But I'm jealous of your kind of zoom telescopic lenses there. I'm needing some more of that in my life, because I've only got a 24-200 just now, which does the job for most things, but there are a couple of moments where you'd really benefit from that extra focal length. But yeah, a shared hobby for all of us, I suppose. But to get into the topic of conversation today, our whole series that we've been running the last little while is on Christian political action, specifically in the context of the fact that globally there are more people expected to vote this year than at any year in human history. We have a UK general election coming up on the 4th of July, which is very soon, but right now it's a few weeks away. So within that context, what does Christian political action look like to you? And we can start off very broad and then just get into the specifics of even your own context, your own work, how your faith influences that. But Dean, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. It's a good question, a big question, how kind of Christian faith interacts with politics. And I've been thinking about it recently for some other things as well. So it's nice to maybe work it out with the two of you. We'll figure out what it means together. Yeah. But the two things that have come to mind for me, one is they're kind of contradictory. One is I think there is a kind of unique Christian imaginative world that can kind of call us into politics in a different way. So some of those things are obvious, drawing from Christian symbols, Christian rhetoric, ideas, a kind of wider imagination about what the future might look like. I think those are all really essential and interesting, and they kind of they create interesting opportunities in politics. So when you see a priest with a collar yelling about nuclear missiles or whatever, that presents a different kind of way into that issue than, your typical activist standing with a sign and so on. And for better and worse. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing, but it is what it is. And I think it can be good. So I think there's a unique kind of archive or repository of stuff in Christianity that can be mobilized in some helpful ways. And not only cynically, too. I think we have these motivations. Christians have, I hope, unique motivations for getting into struggles, solidarity with the poor based on what we think Jesus is calling us to. So I do think there are those kind of very rich, unique features of Christianity that feed in. But the other thing, and maybe the contradictory piece, is sometimes I think Christian participation in politics doesn't necessarily have to look particularly Christian or particularly unique. And that's kind of the Christian thing about it sometimes, that, we're called to be sort of leaven in the dough, which is to say not necessarily the whole dough, trying to kind of cause these social movements to rise in a unique way, making a contribution that we can. And I think that sometimes Christians get hung up on being like, I have to make sure everybody knows that I'm here as a Christian in a Christian way, doing a Christian thing. And I do think there are times and places for that to happen. But I also think just showing up is good. Herbert McCabe, the priest over in your neck of the woods in the UK, he had this really lovely note that Matt and I talk about sometimes on the Magnificast, where he said, the Sermon on the Mount should make you a good comrade. I really like that, that you're trying to be kind of peaceful and humble and kind to one another, which is what you need in the struggle. And I think activist struggles need that as well. So I think Christians can kind of rely on that comportment or disposition to just, be a good ally in the struggle. So both of those things, like I said, they're kind of contradictory. Showing up fully as a Christian, making it very clear and obvious that you're a Christian on purpose, but also kind of being willing to let that part go away when it's important and necessary for building that solidarity.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think what Dean said's good. I like that idea of sometimes not making it about yourself. You don't need to tell everyone that you're here as a Christian. Though I'm saying that in light of literally you and I, William, are going to go to a march tomorrow with signs that say we're here as Christians.
Yep.
But anyways, fair enough. A contradiction I'm willing to live within. And like Dean said, maybe sometimes it's important. When you sent us a message beforehand with these questions, and I was thinking about them a little bit. And when you wrote the words, what does Christian political action or Christian political thought look like? I immediately went the other direction than Dean, and I thought about all the bad things that it means in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's such a funny thing because Dean mentioned that there's this particular Christian imagination that we draw from when it comes to politics. There's an imaginative thinking and all of that. And I think what Dean's saying is exactly right. And I believe in it and I agree with it. And but on the flip side, what does Christian political action look like? I mean, for people in the United States, it meant hundreds of years of chattel slavery. Elsewhere, it meant pogroms, it meant all kinds of homophobia, transphobia, lots of political violence, lots of extremely stupid types of violence. So just want to draw that out. that too counts as Christian political action, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I know. I think that's pointed out well in Marika Rose's most recent book, Theology for the End of the World, that sometimes in realizing that the way that it has upheld these unjust systems and ways of being in the world. But Dean, I think the example that you pointed to of the person that was in the dog collar outside campaigning against nuclear weapons speaks to something of the place of, I suppose, in a way, virtue signaling, but in its proper context of like signaling virtue. And it was a point that was brought up by Wes Streeting, who's the Shadow Health Secretary for the Labour Party here in the UK. And I've got my own personal issues with the Labour Party and with Wes in particular, and some of their policies. But one of the things that he brought up was that the Archbishop of Canterbury had been basically calling out the current Tory government and the prospective Labour government on their refusal to lift the 2-child benefit cap, which is really an unjust and cruel policy, especially for families that are really struggling and keeping hundreds of thousands of children in poverty when it is completely unnecessary. And in that conversation, he was asked, this was Wes Streeting, he was asked about the Archbishop's comments, and he said, well, I think that the Archbishop is his place, particularly to virtue signal, that this is what the church is supposed to do, is point to virtue. And I think it stands kind of apart from this moralizing that exists that we do see, particularly within white evangelical spaces in the US, like a moralizing form of politics that is all about kind of sexual morality, it is about abortion, it's about these particular moral issues, and it's not necessarily pointing to the ultimate good that we're moving towards. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add there about the difference between a Christian political action or form that is pointing to the virtue or the ultimate good or God versus this sort of moralizing form of Christian political action that has been particularly toxic, divisive, and harmful throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking of an action that happened here in Canada recently, which was in solidarity with Palestinians. And that, like everywhere in Canada, there have been lots and lots of like weekly protests, very big, very intense in all the urban centers. And Christians in Canada were kind of thinking, well, what do we do in such a situation? What's our contribution to a movement like that? And it's been a struggle here, like it has been, I'm sure, in many other parts of the world, to try to engage the people that should be virtue signaling in a positive sense, that genocide is bad and wrong. Bishops and pastors and theologians and so on have been kind of reticent to stick their neck out for some of the poorest people in the world who are being obliterated. So, we're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And in response to a solidarity action that had been done around the world during Lent, and probably in Scotland too, I'd guess, there was a pilgrimage kind of call to be organized to walk, I think it's 41 or 2 kilometers, the length of Gaza, in solidarity with the people of Gaza. And so across Canada, we organized these pilgrimages, in different cities and so on, and they were ending in Ottawa, the country's capital, where Parliament is. And we were talking with some kind of organizers in Ottawa, like longtime Christian folks, these great sort of older people who come with a huge reservoir of knowledge and experience. And one of them was just saying how he felt this was especially important because in the Iraq War, in the lead up to it, there was a similar kind of event in Ottawa, and all these Christians got together and kind of made this big push for peace. And the prime minister at the time, I believe Jean Chrétien, had said it was actually seeing all these Christians on the doorstep of Parliament saying, we want peace and we don't want to go to war, that prevented Canada from fully engaging in the invasion with the US and others. I mean, they supported the Iraq War invasion in other ways, but, it could have been worse. And so this person was just saying, there is something uniquely powerful about Christians willing to speak as basically, for lack of a better word, like kind of normal people. There's all these like Catholic Christian grandmas who are out there holding signs saying like, we don't want to bomb children. Like that's pretty powerful and a hard thing to ignore. And I think that Christians, when they mobilize, can kind of disrupt certain stories that shouldn't be told but are told about, the rabble and the left is like all these whatever, like outside funded or hyper educated losers who don't have anything better to do. Like all that stuff is false, but it's harder to tell that story when you see a lot of, people who are motivated by a clear moral kind of imperative or a imaginative horizon that goes beyond obvious geopolitical, games and so on. So that's just maybe a recent action that comes to mind when we're talking about that. There is a kind of unique mobilizing power that mobilizes also a unique constituency, I think, on these issues. And Christianity has that in a way, at least in the West, that other kinds of groups, don't have, or it has a unique way of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. Matt, anything else you would like to add to that?
Just that, like, those kinds of examples are really powerful because oftentimes, I mean, kind of like we were saying a few minutes ago, right, that Christianity is often on both sides of these conflicts. So to mobilize Christians against them is pretty powerful. I mean, especially just like Palestine and against Zionism is like a huge thing at the very moment, right? But that's a great place for Christians to actually speak into because Christians are so deeply complicit in those structures. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think it's a great place for interfaith work as well, and interfaith solidarity, and that if there isn't a particular Christian presence, then it can feel very lacking in terms of, I suppose, the repentance that needs to be done for the past wrongdoings of Christianity, and acknowledging that and standing alongside people who are suffering as a result of the legacy of the kind of historic Christian tradition in the West in particular, and the way that that's had an effect on colonialism, things like Zionism as well. So I think there's a real place for that within it too. I'd be interested to hear, obviously, your podcast, you go into a lot of discussion about political theory and theology and liberation theology and its impact. So how does all of that thinking and pondering about these different ideas impact your activism?
I think that for Christians, there's like this impulse to always say that like everything is coming from my faith. Everything that I'm doing is always based on the Bible or church tradition or the Christian witness or something. And that can be fine and true. But I feel like when it comes to political theory, it gives us like a way to really interpret and put some of those big, lofty, virtuous ideas within Christianity into practice. And, you know, there's a maybe, well, I think there might be a critique in there somewhere that, you know, Christians might look at that and say, well, you're putting politics first or something, and then you're putting your Christianity second. But I think that those two things kind of go hand in hand in a sort of symbiotic relationship where you can't really use the Bible to interpret the world that we live in, because the Bible's is written in such a vastly different situation, historically speaking. So to use political theory to help us, to use political theory and the Bible and Scripture to help us kind of make sense of the moment that we're in is a maybe more helpful way of going about it. So yeah, I think that we can kind of interpret both political theory and Scripture and the Christian tradition kind of in light of one another in sort of a playful way that maybe is productive for political action. Yeah, Dean, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think kind of building on that too, there is sometimes almost an anti-intellectual trend, and not only in Christianity, but also in the left generally, that you kind of have to look busy or be busy, or else you're not really, you know, getting something done. And I understand that like issues are urgent and they do demand immediacy and so on. But I think also the longer you spend organizing, the longer you find yourself thinking, wow, that I need to think differently about this, or I'm not making headway, or this doesn't seem to be working. And when those inevitable questions come up, you've got to find people who are thinking that through. And I think that it's a dialectical relationship. You know, you can't kind of sacrifice theory for action and vice versa. And I do think a lot of academics too, like, you know, you are trying to do some action or organize some coalition or whatever. So you go looking to read an academic who you think might help you out. And it becomes painfully obvious that like this person has never had to do anything, you know, in a group of people before. And so I think you can kind of overemphasize the importance of both. But it is significant, I think, to try to get some theory going in these places. And also in the tradition of liberation theology, that has been a big plank or big approach, I guess you could say, to how liberation theology emerges, especially in Latin America, other places too, but especially in that context. So, for example, you might have a base community, a kind of informal group of Christians meeting to talk about the Bible and participate in the structure of the church and so on, but they also want to do something like, you know, make a demand about indigenous rights to land, or they might want to push a mining company out of their community. And when they do that, they're going to have to learn something about mining companies and how they work and how mining works and so on. And they do that. Like there's this kind of putting together of the life of just being together and organizing and even doing kind of spiritual work together, and also being informed and capable activists. So I think especially in the global South, those of us in the North have a lot to learn, because sometimes in the North, this is not true for everyone, but for many of us, participating in social justice is kind of voluntary. Like you could drop out and do something else if you really wanted to. Whereas in the global South, it can be, you know, demanded of you because the mine is going to open up next to your town, whether you like it or not. And you have to sort of do something about that. Again, not true for everyone. Many of us have the privilege to choose or not social justice struggles. But just to say, I think the South kind of has developed a lot of strategies and examples that we can use to figure out why is political theory necessary, why is reading a theologian necessary, and I think that, you know, the proof is in the pudding. Like they do get wins and have a lot to teach us too.
And I think that with that privilege of being able to choose whether or not you engage with the struggle of fighting for social justice, there's this similar tendency of those who are in that privileged position of jumping in, feeling like they have the answers or have the solutions where they're potentially not as engaged. So they might come in with an easy solution to the context of what's going on in Gaza currently without fully understanding the last 75 years of history and really just being aware of the struggle since October the 7th, rather than engaging with the kind of all the past atrocities of the settler colonial state of Israel, or dealing with the past kind of Nakba and knowing that context and history. And therefore, when they are purporting to act in solidarity, they could often be doing more harm than good by failing to listen, engage with theory, engage with thought, listen to Palestinian theologians and writers and activists who are quite clearly telling us what they're looking for when it comes to acts of solidarity and following that pattern that's kind of been set before. So I think it brings us on to the next question, which is, how important is the concept of solidarity to you, both in your faith and in your activism? Matt, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I can say something about that. There's a theologian that we talk about on the podcast, on the Magnificast, quite a bit, named Ignacio Ellacuria. He's a Salvadoran liberation theologian who was murdered along with a handful of other Jesuit priests. And he has a bit of writing where he talks about the crucified people. And when he's talking about the crucified people, he's kind of drawing out an insight that you get from the gospel, but also some context about what that might mean politically speaking, or in terms of like an understanding of class awareness. So he says in this essay that, Jesus died, he was crucified, because that's what the world does to people like Jesus. They crucify him. And he says that there's an entire class of people that are always being crucified within our society. There are people who are crucified in slow and painful ways, like really impoverished lives with low wages, with no access to any kind of like economic mobility and so on, crucified like that. There are also people crucified by genocides, like in Palestine. There are people who are crucified by awful conditions, like Dean said, like a mine or something. They're crucified through all these different ways. And solidarity is a way to intervene in that extremely slow crucifixion of this entire population of people. And I think that maybe there's something really Christian about the idea of solidarity, or at least there's a really Christian way to act out of solidarity. That when you see people who are being crucified, who are like Jesus in that sense, who are suffering, oftentimes like because of large structures that we benefit from, solidarity is a way to kind of step into the situation and take on that situation to maybe not be crucified with them, hopefully not, but to help take them off the cross altogether.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think too, solidarity, I work for a solidarity movement, so I guess I think about it a lot and try to do a good job at it, and sometimes more and less successfully. But I think for me anyway, it's interesting to reflect on solidarity too, as I guess along similar lines we've been talking about throughout the show with respect to Christianity, where it can be a bit of a double-edged sword, or to bring in an intellectual, I guess, because Matt and I are always talking about weird French philosophers on the Magnificast in spite of ourselves. But there's a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who is a deeply confusing person, but he has, I think, some really interesting things to say about even words like community or hospitality. So, for example, he has this really kind of troubling insight where he says in the middle of the word community is the root munis, which is also where we get the term munitions. And there's this, he kind of plays with that to say community, it's a beautiful thing, a wonderful thing, a necessary thing. We need community. And at the same time, the kinds of things that we benefit from in community, these kind of bonds and circles of trust and so on, those very things that we like about community also create the conditions by which we exclude others, fear others, do violence to others, and so on. And I think solidarity is often very similar. It's very necessary. We have to have it. We need to do it. But the very things that we kind of value in solidarity, for example, building a common cause to address this or that issue, those kinds of commitments can also create all kinds of other problems, or, they can force some kind of angles of oppression to be sidelined in the interest of building solidarity toward a specific end or aim. Also something I think you learn pretty quickly, organizing in big coalition, everybody's got their particular issue kind of positively stated. Like, everybody comes to the table for a certain reason. And in the course of building solidarity, the challenge, I think, is to try to build a coalition, a network, a set of relationships that is capable of kind of always being able to listen to who is crying out within that coalition, and trying to be accountable to the to the many different vectors of oppression that happen. I think maybe it's also a good opportunity for me to own, what I'm talking about. Like, some of us have the privilege of entering into social justice in the North. It's like, even saying something like that is sort of a betrayal of other solidarity networks that I participate in, right? Like, other people do not have that kind of privilege, and I'm able to speak from that by virtue of being a white man who's educated and Christian and so on, living in Canada with a U.S. passport, all these kinds of things that stack up. And something I like about solidarity work is that it's always kind of forcing me to reconsider, like, how I'm speaking and from where I'm speaking, and again, kind of, in more and less successful ways. So I think solidarity can be like this double-edged sword, and it also gives us an opportunity to sort of get a little bit deeper with our own reflection on how we're entering into those struggles.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. As we begin to kind of wrap up this podcast, what I would love to talk about, just as we're coming to the end, is thinking about, obviously, the various elections across the globe that are coming up, and the different ways in which we've already discussed people can participate in political action or do take part in that, and how their faith influences it. How does your faith influence your politics? How does it help you discern who you would vote for, if you're going to vote at all, and what sort of groups you would like participate in? How does it help you think through those things on a personal level, I suppose? Dean, do you want to start us off with that one?
Sure. Voting, man. I hate it. I don't like it. That's my unpopular opinion. Democracy is frustrating, but I do it in spite of that deep disdain for the whole process. And maybe I'll just say something about that tension. I have the benefit of being able to vote in two elections, the U.S. election and soon the Canadian election. We'll probably go to the polls next year, but it could be earlier. And when I think about those things, I think, on the one hand, it's true what many left-wing people say, that elections are a distraction from more important issues. I think that's true. I think that elections kind of suck up a lot of time and resources and energy. They take us away from other kinds of organizing that is, frankly, more important than getting somebody into an elected seat. And I think a lot of people feel that the extent of their political action kind of starts and ends at the voting booth. The most engaged they could imagine is being a well-informed voter, maybe volunteering for a party or something, and then kind of hoping for the best. And I think leftists are right to say that, that's a bad trade. If you have to trade electoral participation for building the kinds of people power that we need to actually make demands of our elected officials and other kinds of systems, that's a bad trade. At the same time, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a trade or a zero-sum thing. I think the other kind of temptation is to think that voting doesn't matter at all, that it's completely arbitrary, and that in the end, it doesn't really make a difference who's in power. I think it does make a difference. They can be marginal differences. They can be shades of differences on certain issues. They can even be essentially not different at all. But at the end of the day, some left-wing theorists talk about what we call non-reformist reforms, that you can kind of vote for a reform that isn't going to change the system, but might kind of at least slow the bloodletting, for a while, which is not good, but better than it would have been. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about elections, is how do you kind of keep the damage as contained as you can with that one tool. And I think ultimately, when I think about elections, the thing that I think is most important is to say they basically don't, they shouldn't take up that much space in your brain. I think it's usually fairly obvious in an election who you should vote for. Like, if you take the time to really think about it, and you're a generally progressive person, I don't think it takes a lot of guesswork to figure out what box you should check. And I think you should just do that like 5-minute back of the napkin electoral math, figure out which box you should check, and then just kind of forget about it, get back to the important stuff. So all that to say, like, yeah, elections, they don't matter except that they kind of do. I think you should just do it and forget about it. That's sort of my hot take.
I think, it's a very understandable feeling and take, especially when you consider the fact that in the US especially, it's a two-party system. In the UK, it's increasingly feeling more and more like that as both Labour and the Tories refuse to bring any form of electoral reform, despite the fact that the majority of Labour membership have voted for it multiple times and that almost every other major party is calling for electoral reform. So it is very frustrating when you see that as really just marginal changes or changes to the shade or color of politician in terms of the badge that they wear, which can be very frustrating and lead you to that. But I think it's right. It's building those. And I think this has been the whole point of this series is to try and show that political action goes beyond just the ballot box, and that really the important political action that we take is in our communities, in our workplaces, with the people that are our neighbours, and standing in solidarity with those who are suffering near us and in our lives that we can see, and making a difference in those areas. And as part of that, that feeds into that wider network of change and disruption that can be part of it. But Matt, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, maybe. I endorse everything that Dean just said for sure. Well, he's right. We've talked about this at length before, multiple times, so that shouldn't be too surprising, I guess. But earlier Dean said that we like to talk about French philosophers, and we do, and I'm going to do it again. There's a French philosopher named Jacques Rancière who is very enamored with the idea of democracy. He has a book that's called Hatred of Democracy, and he's extremely pro-democracy as a philosopher. Important note to make. But part of the argument of his book is that people who are like really excited about electoral politics and people who treat it like it's the main event of political life actually hate democracy because electoral politics are a negotiated limit on the type of democracy that you actually have and no more, right? That's as democratic as it gets. And he says that democracy is not like a finished, stable state or set of affairs. It's like something that you have to fight tooth and nail for in every aspect of life. So I think what Dean says is right. Do the math on the back of your napkin about who to vote for. Figure it out. Maybe in your neck of the woods there might be like other important things to vote on. Like in the United States, there's always amendments to state laws and so on. That stuff's pretty important, I would say. But otherwise, I would think about all the other places you might try to build a more democratic life in your everyday life. Do you have a union at work? Can you lobby for a better raise with your coworkers? That seems like an important piece of democracy. Can you negotiate with your tenants in your building to get a lower rent or to fix something important? That seems like pretty important democracy. Can you rally together with students at your school and demand lower fees and better pay for lecturers and better stipends? That seems like important democracy too. So I guess I would just electoral politics, it's fine for what it's worth, but it always feels like not enough. And maybe we should look for the other places where we could make life more democratic.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you both for coming on today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. If people are wanting to find the Magnificast, where would they be able to engage with your work as part of that?
Any single one you can think of, we're on it. We're on Spotify and Apple and Android and whatever. We're on Twitter at the Magnificast. We're on Instagram at the Magnificast. We put out a weekly episode usually. So yeah, jump in, take a listen, do whatever you want with that information.
Yeah, there's also a great Discord community supported by our Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. And it's really fun. It's a great group of Christian lefty types. And it's everything from talking about weird French philosophy to, I don't know, sharing very funny, incredibly niche biblical leftist memes. And we made a whole channel to talk about photography. It turns out everybody's taking pictures in this community. So it's a great group of folks, and you can definitely get in on it.
That's a good note about the Magnificast, that it's a podcast. We're Dean and I are talking all the time too much, but it is like a community of listeners, and I think that is really important. There's a bigger thing going on around our podcast than just two dudes.
Yeah, and I was speaking to one of my colleagues earlier today who'd just been doing a workshop with some university students and had said that someone was wearing some Magnificast merch. Do you still have the merch store up and active online?
We do.
Yeah.
And you can find it by going to our Twitter. Sorry, I can't think of the URL off the top of my head.
That's fine. I'll add it in with the show notes, so I'll make sure that people can access that so that we can see more of it at SCM workshops and events. But yeah, thank you both so much for coming on today.
Thanks, William. Thanks to the SCM too.
Thanks.
Really glad to hear it's going well in the UK, and it's such an important movement. That's maybe something I just want to plug at the end. I think SCM is really exciting to me. Like, I just feel like we're in a moment where a lot of Christian progressive stuff is like on the decline, or it's like, oh, this was really cool in the 1970s and 80s, and like nobody's doing it anymore. And I think when you meet people in SCM around the world, there's such a like vibrant kind of living tradition of that's in continuity with all the cool stuff that's come before. So it just like warms my heart to meet SCM folks and hear that it's going strong. And yeah, thanks for all the work you guys are doing over there in the UK.
Thanks for joining us on the SCM podcast. As always, you can find us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Student Christian Movement, or on X at SCM_Britain. Every episode of Season 3 comes with an accompanying blog looking more in depth at the topics discussed. These come out every Monday after the podcast is released. So check out the latest blog on our website at movement.org.uk, and thanks for listening.